Hi all, so in this video I'm going to review a sample essay so that I can talk about the requirements for your essay assignment and what my expectations are. So hopefully you've reviewed the assignment sheet for this essay, and now I'm just going to dive into this essay, which would be an A paper for my class. And I'm going to take some notes on what the author does and create sort of a checklist that you can follow when you're doing your paper. So note first the formatting. We got the information up in the top left-hand corner. We got a title up top. I'm requiring MLA format for this paper. So the title is Talk About Giving Till It Hurts. What should we do about the world hunger problem? Some, such as Robert Nozick, might say that since I have a right to private property, provided I have not acquired it through force or fraud, I'm entitled to my wealth and need not give anything to starving nations. Others, like Peter Singer, think that we owe it to these nations to help them out, to maximize the overall happiness in the world, as long as we do not sacrifice something of comparable moral significance. In this paper, I will explain and examine Peter Singer's argument and will attempt to show that Singer's argument is a plausible one by replying to two objections against his view. Alright, so that's the introductory paragraph in an argumentative essay, and let's talk about some of the things the author does here, which you should do as well. So paragraph 1, we have the introduction. And let's get some bullet points here. So one thing the author does is jump right into the issue. So there's no fluff about philosophers considering world hunger since the beginning of time or anything like that. The author just jumps right in and asks a question. What should we do about the world hunger problem? There's a problem. What should we do to solve it? And then after that, so this is a hook for an essay, and you should have this for an argumentative essay. In one little sentence, talk about why what you're discussing matters. Just a little bit of a hook to get the reader engaged. So then in the next couple sentences, the author presents some opposing views. Robert Nozick has one position, Peter Singer has an opposing position. So that's a good way to do it. So after introducing opposing views, and one thing to note here, the author has a citation even when the author is just paraphrasing what somebody else says, and that's something you should definitely do in your essay. So not only should you have a citation for every quote that you have in your paper, but every paraphrase that you have in your paper as well. So a good rule of thumb is any idea which is not common knowledge, you should have a citation for in an academic paper. Alright, so the author sets up those opposing views, and then in the last sentence, in this paper, I will explain and examine Peter Singer's argument, and will attempt to show that Singer's argument is a plausible one by replying to two objections against his view. So this is what we call a thesis statement. And for your thesis statement, you have two options. Either your target argument is good, or the other option is the target argument is bad. Only two options for your thesis statement for this paper. So you're analyzing somebody else's argument in this paper. So I will explain and examine Peter Singer's argument and will attempt to show that Singer's argument is a plausible one. So in other words, that he has a good argument. And how's the author going to show it? So after that, the author offers a plan. He's going to show it by replying to 2 objections against his view. And in this paper, your plan can be one of 2 things. If your target argument is good, then you are going to show that by replying to 2 objections. And if the target argument is bad, then the way you would show that is by showing that the author can't reply to some of the objections, or the objections, let's put it this way, the objections defeat the argument. All right, so jump right into the issue with a hook. Introduce opposing views. Have a thesis statement about one of the views that you introduce, and then set out a plan for how you are going to proceed in the paper. So another thing to note here is the use of the word I. You may have had professors or teachers who told you not to use the word I. That's not the case in argumentative papers. You should be using the word I. What it indicates to me is what you're doing above and beyond what other people have done. So it sets off your work from other people's. Because as we'll see when we go on, an argumentative paper is mostly just presenting other people's views. The evaluating their views is your work, but that only comprises a small percentage of your paper, the most important part of your paper, but a small percentage of your paper. So in your thesis statement, make sure you say what you will be doing and how you will be doing it in this paper. All right, so moving on. Singer is a utilitarian, so he thinks that we should do whatever maximizes happiness for the affected population. In the case of world hunger, the affluent nations and the poorest starving nations are affected. So from a utilitarian standpoint, we need to look at people in affluent nations, such as the United States, Great Britain, and France, as well as nations such as Chad and Nigeria. Singer, in his article Rich and Poor in Morality and Moral Controversies, argues that the pain caused to the people in affluent nations is not as great as the pleasure it would cause in the people in starving nations. So we, as members of an affluent nation, have an obligation to give them aid. All right, so what does the author do here in the second paragraph? So what the author does here is explain a little bit about the author's, introduce the author's background theory. So in this case, Singer is a utilitarian, so the author calls that out. And in addition, starts talking, just giving a sketch of the author's argument. So background theory, if appropriate, and sketch of argument, implications, if argument is accepted, so why is this an interesting topic? You're still doing that a little bit in the second paragraph. Introducing their conclusion. So let's sketch of the argument. Let's put implications if conclusion were accepted. So briefly sketch the argument. What are the implications if the conclusion were to be accepted? And is there a background theory that the author is working with? So now let's look at the third paragraph. In order to argue in favor of his point, Singer makes 2 assumptions: that absolute poverty with its hunger and malnutrition, lack of shelter, literacy, disease, high infant mortality, and low life expectancy is a bad thing, and it is within the power of the affluent to reduce absolute poverty without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance. Before continuing, it is necessary to understand what Singer understands by absolute poverty and comparable moral significance. Singer defines absolute poverty as income level insufficient to provide adequate nutrition. 800 million people in 79. Comparable moral significance can be explained as follows. The word comparable is getting at the idea that you need to weigh different rights and duties and see which is more important. In this case, the right to property needs to be weighed against the right to life. Singer thinks the right to life is more important than the right to property. He gives an example of someone's weighing getting their pants wet versus saving a drowning child in a small wading pond. He says the child's right to life outweighs the property right of the helper. Using this reasoning, Singer thinks analogously that the affluent are only justified in having a right to own not much more than the basic necessities of life when compared to what suffering and pain could be prevented were the affluent to give aid to starving nations instead. For example, in this passage, Singer argues that giving is not a matter of charity but an obligation we all have. I'll skip that text. So Singer does not see a difference between the child drowning example and the current suffering of people from starvation, and it is contrary to Nozick's view not merely charity to help these people, but an obligation to minimize suffering and maximize happiness of everyone involved. All right, so what does the author do here in the third paragraph? One thing the author does right at the beginning of this paragraph is introduce the premises. So there are two premises or assumptions that Singer makes to get his argument off the ground. So introduce and explain premises. And then right after that, the author defines some key terms. So in the premises were terms like absolute poverty and terms like comparable moral significance. So the author takes it upon himself to define those terms that are in the premises. And that's a really good thing to do, something you should definitely do regardless of your topic in this class. So define any key terms. All right. Also, if there are any sub-arguments for the premises, so if there are any thought experiments given to support any of the premises, this or the next paragraph would be a good place to discuss those. All right, so moving on to the fourth paragraph. Now you might be asking, when do we stop giving? Is Singer saying that I have to give away all my money? To clarify, Singer states that we should give until we reach the point of marginal utility, which is the point at which you can still help others without ruining yourself. And he does grant that performing this obligation necessitates a massive lifestyle change for an affluent person. He also adds that how much we need to give depends on our view of comparable moral significance. However, he asks, how can one justify buying a new CD when that money could be given to some organization that would provide food or medicine to someone who really needs it? The sacrifice made would be worth it if everyone were happy. So what's the author doing here in paragraph 4? Clarifying, really. Continued explanation and clarification of the argument. Let's put paragraphs 4 and 5 together. You can reduce them to 1 if you'd like. Let's put clarification here. All right, so the next paragraph. I think Singer makes a very plausible argument in favor of world hunger donation, because a strong argument can be made that at the very least, not helping someone when doing so will save another person's life, and will not be costly to the donor is morally wrong. Singer, of course, takes that argument and extends it to include one's giving until one is weighing comparable expenses. And though that is controversial, it is quite compelling as a moral argument. But Singer also allows each of us to decide what comparable moral significance is, which will allow for variation in donations, another plus for his view. All right, so what's the author do in, let's separate these. So that was paragraph 4, and then let's do paragraph 5 here. So in paragraph 5, the author talks about good features of the argument, why it seems at least on the face of it to be a plausible argument. And this is something you should do regardless of whether your conclusion is that it's a good argument or a bad argument. And there are many good reasons for that. So explain why argument, or explain good features of argument. Why is it plausible? Or plausible means something like believable or persuasive. The reason you should do that, even if you're going to attack the argument, is imagine you didn't do this and you started the paper by saying that somebody makes a horrible argument and you're going to show exactly why it's horrible. Well, if that's what you accomplish in your paper, just showing that an obviously horrible argument is horrible, then you haven't done very much with your paper and it's not very interesting. Think, on the other hand, about how interesting it would be if you said, this argument seems great. And many people believe it, and it has all of these implications in our world today. But unfortunately, there's this tiny problem with the third premise in the argument that I'm going to explain in this paper. Now, that's an interesting project. I mean, it sounds sort of like clickbait journalism, right? So you won't believe number 10 in this list of things. But that is an interesting hook, and it shows me that you understand first, so why this article is famous, why we read it in our class, why I selected it to be in the class. If you say an article is obviously terrible, then you're telling me that I selected something to read that was obviously terrible. Now, it could be the case, but you're starting off in very precarious territory by stating that. So you want to show why the argument has gained such popularity, such that it's included in an Intro to Ethics class. All right, so now we move on to the 7th paragraph. Everyone obviously does not agree with Singer's view. Singer's opponents might object that we affluent people have a right to our property, and that donating to world hunger is a gift, not an obligation. Ayn Rand has said, no man can have a right to impose an unchosen obligation or unrewarded duty on another. There can be no such thing as the right to enslave. This view is echoed by Robert Nozick, so these poor nations would be in effect enslaving us to work for them and provide them with food. Sorry, paragraph 6. So what happens in paragraph 6? Finally, we get an objection. And I'm going to put objection 1. So note a few things. In this paper, we are almost 3 pages in. So 2.5 pages in before we're first introduced to an objection. And why is that? That's because there's a lot of groundwork to be laid about an argument before you start attacking it. You want to make sure you're not straw-manning the argument, so in other words, making it seem weaker than it actually is before you start attacking it. You want to make sure you're really attacking the argument, not a bad retelling of the argument. So note that, and then note also that the objection gets itself a full paragraph. Explain it as much as you can. Give it, a shortened treatment that you gave the target argument itself. So if there is a thought experiment that supports the objection, put that in here. And if you can attribute the objection to somebody else, then if you got it from somebody else, then make sure you do that too. So first we get the objection, and then we get the next paragraph. Singer could reply to this objection, however, by arguing that property rights are not more important or basic than the right to life. If you can save someone with $1 or 1 minute of your time, then you owe that money or time to that person. If you were starving and knew that someone made a decision not to help you after deciding instead to go to a movie that they really didn't want or need to see, while you starved to death, how would that make you feel? So property rights, at least when compared to the right to life, should be overridden. Also, to respond to Ayn Rand, Singer might reply by arguing that a person with a right to life in fact imposes an unchosen obligation on others' behalf, whether or not they like it. If this is correct, then a person can have a right to impose an unrewarded duty upon another. So, what do we get in paragraph 7? We get the evaluation of objection 1. So why do I put evaluation instead of response? If your thesis was that the argument was good, then what you'll have to say about the objection, you'll have to respond to it, say that the objection doesn't stand because of some reasons. If your initial thesis was that the target argument is bad, then in your evaluation of the objections, you're going to have to say that at least one objection is good and actually defeats the argument, so isn't defeated by any possible responses. So evaluate objection 1. If objection 1 is good, that means it defeats the argument. If it's bad, that means it doesn't defeat the argument. All right, so here in paragraphs, let's see where we're at, 8 and 9, we get a copy of 6 and 7. So we get in paragraph 8, we get, oh, let's do it this way. Paragraph 8, we get objection 2. We get a second objection, and in paragraph 9, we get an evaluation of the second objection. And again, if you're arguing that the argument's bad, then at least one of the objections has to defeat the argument. If you're arguing that the argument is good, then both of the objections, you need to have good responses to them. All right, so now let's skip down to what will be paragraph 10, the conclusion. So what do you do in the conclusion of an argumentative essay? In conclusion, I've examined Singer's argument in favor of donating to world hunger and tried to show that he makes a good argument for his position. In order to do that, I considered 2 objections against his view and arguably gave some plausible responses on his behalf. Though Singer's position demands a lot from affluent nations, we cannot deny our moral responsibility to help out people whose lives depend on receiving aid. World hunger is an important issue, and much more work is needed in order to discover what the best way of relieving it is. For example, I've not shown that Locke's view is definitely incorrect, though I've tried to answer an objection that he may have made. Whether or not Locke is correct is another issue for another day. All right. So, what does the author do in the conclusion? One thing he does is say what he accomplished. So if in the introduction you say what you're going to set out to prove and how you're going to prove it in future tense, in the conclusion you lay out in past tense what you have accomplished. All right, so that's pretty straightforward, and this is why this style of writing an argument essay is called a closed writing style, because it's bookended by you saying what you're going to do at the beginning and you saying what you did at the end. So along the way, there shouldn't really be too many surprises. When somebody reads your introduction, they should know your sort of basic argumentative strategy, what your thesis is going to be, how you're going to try to prove it. And at the end, you should highlight again what you did in the body of your essay. And of course, you need to deliver on that in the body of the essay. Okay, so now there's something else that is really cool about this conclusion. And that's what the author does in the end here, when he says, world hunger is an important issue and much more work is needed in order to discover what the best way of relieving it is, and then introduces another problem. So what I take the author to be doing here is tell the audience what the next step is. So when you're writing an argumentative academic paper, imagine that you're part of a research community that's working on this problem, and that when people read your essay, they'll be impressed by your argument and think, wow, they really solved this little piece of this problem. But how can I build on this person's research and argumentation? It's a really impressive move. It shows that you know the scope of your project and how it fits into a larger project. If you can pull this off in an essay, your professors will be very impressed. I know I am when a student pulls this off. One thing you shouldn't do, don't introduce an author or a view that you don't introduce anybody new into the conclusion, especially if you don't explain their view. At the end of this, I'm left wondering, okay, what's Locke's view and what does it have to do with this issue? Instead, if you are going to introduce somebody in the conclusion, then make sure you give a quick blurb about their view and why that would be the next step. All right, so tell the audience what the next step is. Very impressive move to make at the conclusion of an argumentative essay. Now, at the end of your essay, you'll need a works cited page in which you cite all the sources that you used to make your paper. At the end of this paper, there are explanations of why this paper is good. And I'm including the document for this example essay on Canvas, so you can take a look at this at your leisure. But that's the end today. Hopefully this helps you write better argumentative papers for my class, since you know what I'm expecting, and for your other classes where arguments are required. So thanks for tuning in. I wish you luck on your paper. I'll put both of these documents on Canvas for your reference. All right, all. See you next time.